In the fall of 1988, when the air over Nova Scotia's South Mountain carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, a social worker followed a dirt trail that locals warned her not to take. The path led to a valley untouched by time. No power lines, no paved roads, no sign of life except for a cluster of collapsing shacks half hidden beneath a web of spruce trees. What she found there would shake Canada to its core. A family so isolated, so deeply entangled in their own twisted world, that it was hard to believe they'd ever been part of civilization. In the late autumn of 1988, the narrow logging roads winding through Nova Scotia's South Mountain were already fading under a crust of frost. A social worker named Margaret Hill had been assigned a case that most of her colleagues quietly avoided, a complaint about missing school-aged children somewhere beyond the last mapped road, where the hills dipped into a valley people seldom mentioned. Locals called it the Gully, a name spoken with a tone that mixed pity and discomfort. There were rumors, half-told stories about a clan that lived deep in the woods, unseen but occasionally heard at night, voices carrying through the trees, fires flickering miles from any town. Margaret, trained to expect neglect or poverty, packed her coat, flashlight, and a box of paperwork she believed would help bring a few forgotten kids back into the system. What she found instead would follow her for the rest of her life. The trail to the Goler settlement was more animal path than road. The trees leaned close, forming a damp tunnel of pine and birch that swallowed the sound of her footsteps. After nearly 2 hours of walking, the forest opened into a clearing where smoke curled weakly from a rusted stovepipe jutting out of a shack. The structure looked less built than assembled. Planks, tin, and stones held together by a strange sense of defiance against collapse. She knocked, called out, and when the door creaked open, a small, dirt-covered child stared at her with wide, hollow eyes. Behind the child, others lurked in the dimness, barefoot, silent, their skin pale beneath layers of grime. Margaret's first impression was confusion. There was no furniture, no electricity, no food she could see, just piles of rags, cracked jars, and the faint smell of decay. The air was thick, humid, as if the shack itself was breathing. She asked for the parents, but the children didn't answer. They simply pointed toward another shack at the far edge of the clearing, one with no windows and a door chained shut. It was then she noticed how quiet the valley was. No birds, no insects, only the faint rush of wind slipping between the hills. When she finally found the adults, they appeared startled, blinking at her as if the sight of another human was something foreign. Their speech was slow, words tangled with strange inflections. By the time the authorities arrived later that week, the valley had become a scene from another time. Children who had never seen a classroom, families who had forgotten the outside world existed, and a silence that seemed to deepen the longer anyone stayed there. The Goler-Clan's discovery wasn't just the uncovering of neglect. It was the unearthing of an entire hidden world that civilization had long since left behind. When the Goler children were first taken from the valley, they were quiet, almost eerily so. At the Child Services office in Kentville, the youngest cried, without tears, while the older ones simply stared at the walls, flinching at the sound of doors closing. Days passed before any of them spoke more than a few words. The social workers, trained to handle trauma, struggled to break through the wall of silence that surrounded them. It wasn't until one of the eldest girls, believed to be around 15 though, she looked closer to 10, began to draw pictures that the truth started to take shape. Her drawings were crude and childlike, but they carried something unmistakable. Dark figures standing around fires, children lying in the dirt, eyes watching from the woods. When asked who the figures were, she whispered a word that none of the workers understood at first, them. Gradually, she began to talk. The words came out in fragments, like pieces of a nightmare that refused to stay buried. She spoke about nights when the fires burned high and voices called from beyond the trees. She said the older men and women would gather everyone and whisper prayers to something that lived under the hill. At first, investigators assumed these were the confused memories of a neglected child, a mind trying to make sense of fear. But the more she talked, the more details emerged, specific names, strange rituals, and a pattern of behavior that no one could have invented. She said it had always been that way, long before she was born, long before her grandparents were young. The confession spread unease through the investigation team. They had come expecting poverty, isolation, and perhaps abuse, but this felt different, something older, deliberate. The girl described how certain nights were called the gatherings, and how the children were told that if they ever tried to leave the valley, the thing under the hill would come for them. She said she'd seen it once, a shape in the dark, taller than a man, moving through the trees without sound. The room grew still when she described it, her eyes darting to the corners as if afraid the words might summon it again. Her account was the first real crack in the silence surrounding the Goler-Clan. More children began to speak after her, their stories overlapping, each one echoing the same elements: fires, chanting, and a presence that no one could explain. It became clear that what had happened in that valley wasn't simply neglect, but the preservation of something ritualistic, something that blurred the line between family tradition and a dark inheritance no one outside their bloodline could understand. When the authorities returned to the valley to collect evidence, the forest seemed to resist them. The wind rose without warning, sending a low moan through the trees, and every path looked the same no matter which direction they took. Police and forensic teams moved carefully through the clearing, their boots sinking into the wet earth as they began to document what the Goler family had left behind. At first, they focused on the obvious: rotting shacks, piles of refuse, and the remnants of a life lived far from civilization. But deeper in the woods, just beyond the main cabin, one officer noticed something odd. Trees marked with symbols carved into their bark, shapes that didn't match any known language. The cuts were old, deep enough that the wood had tried to heal over them, leaving swollen ridges that looked almost like veins. The search expanded over several acres, and soon they began uncovering small mounds of earth, each one carefully arranged with stones placed in a circular pattern. When they dug, they expected to find animal remains, perhaps a hunter's cache or discarded traps. But what they uncovered was stranger. Dozens of bones, many belonging to small animals, had been buried deliberately. They were arranged in symmetrical patterns, sometimes bound together with twine made from animal sinew. In a few of the pits, fragments of fabric and glass were found, as though the bones had been part of some kind of offering. The deeper they dug, the more the air seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the stench of decay. It was something heavier, a pressure that made the men whisper to one another in short, nervous bursts. Then came the discovery that changed the course of the investigation entirely. Near the back of the property, where the ground dipped toward the base of the hill, a small pit was uncovered. Inside were human remains, at least 2 sets, partially decomposed, the bones fragile and discolored. The forensic team could tell that they had been there for years, possibly decades. The arrangement matched the earlier finds: a circle of stones, a careful layering of objects, as though whoever buried them had followed specific instructions. The investigators photographed everything, but several of the pictures later came out blurred, as if the camera lenses had been clouded by mist. By nightfall, when the team began to pack up, one of the younger officers noticed fresh carvings on a nearby tree, marks that hadn't been there that morning. They looked identical to the others, but the cuts were raw, the bark still bleeding sap. No one admitted to making them, and the air turned strangely still as they left the valley behind. What they didn't know was that the patterns continued beyond their search perimeter, winding deeper into the forest, as if leading towards something the Goler family had been guarding for generations. In the months following the initial discovery, the investigation widened into a case that stretched across counties. The Goler adults were rounded up one by one. Men and women who looked decades older than their actual age, their faces weathered and eyes hollow from a life lived far from sunlight and law. Their arrest photos became symbols of rural decay, splashed across newspapers. But behind those faces lay something far more disturbing than the public was told. During questioning, the family members contradicted each other constantly, yet their stories shared one haunting similarity. None of them took responsibility. Each claimed that what had been done, the rituals, the abuse, the isolation had been started long before them, and that they were only continuing the way of the family. When detectives pressed for who had begun it, a single name came up again and again: Aunt Ruth. At first, investigators assumed Ruth was another relative living elsewhere or one who had escaped years earlier. They searched records, combed through birth certificates and land deeds, but no such person existed. The clan's genealogy was a tangle of intermarriages and missing documentation, yet not one trace of a Ruth appeared anywhere. Still, the name persisted, surfacing in interviews with both adults and children. One boy whispered that Ruth lived under the hill, while another said she came only when the fires were lit. The adults grew agitated whenever her name was mentioned, some breaking into prayer, others insisting that Ruth was family but not alive in the usual way. Meanwhile, the investigators discovered that the clan's isolation hadn't been accidental. Decades earlier, an elder member had purchased the land using a false name and built the shacks deliberately away from public view. The locals had avoided the area for generations, muttering about lights in the woods and strange cries that echoed through the valley on certain nights. Older residents recalled seeing smoke rise from the hills during storms, when no one should have been out there. When asked about these stories, surviving Golers reacted with nervous laughter or silence. They spoke of Ruth as though she were both a person and a curse, someone whose absence was as heavy as her presence. Investigators pieced together fragments from interviews, court documents, and local folklore, but the shape of the truth kept shifting. The Goler family's crimes were clear, but what had driven them? The rituals, the carvings, the whispered name of a woman who left no record, hinted at something deeper. Aunt Ruth had become more than a missing person. She was the ghostly core of a legacy that refused to die, an echo binding the clan to whatever darkness had taken root beneath that forgotten hill. After the arrests and the media storm that followed, the valley was left to rot in silence. The cabins were boarded up, the surrounding land declared off-limits, and the last of the Goler family members were taken away in unmarked vans. For a while, the locals believed that would be the end of it. Yet not long after the police withdrew, people living near the forest began to whisper about strange occurrences that didn't fit into the rational explanations the newspapers offered. It started with lights, small, flickering orbs seen weaving through the trees late at night. Hunters said they looked like lanterns moving in patterns too deliberate to be tricks of the eye. Then came the voices, faint at first, drifting on the wind like broken echoes. Some claimed they sounded like children calling from far away. Others said it was chanting, low and rhythmic, as if something ancient had resumed exactly where it had been interrupted. A farmer named Ellis Moore, whose property bordered the old Goler land, reported hearing footsteps outside his house every night for a week. When he finally stepped outside with a flashlight, he saw nothing but damp earth covered in prints, bare footprints, small and uneven, circling his porch. The next morning, his barn door was found wide open, and all the livestock huddled in one corner, trembling. He left the valley 2 days later and never returned. Soon, others began to speak up. Campers who wandered too close to the area claimed their fires went out without warning. Some described a sound like a woman humming, followed by the sensation of being watched from the treeline. Dogs refused to enter the woods, and even the birds seemed to avoid flying over that patch of land. Investigators dismissed these reports as fear-fed rumors, the kind that grow around any tragedy. But those who had seen the valley before said it felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the ground itself had absorbed what had happened and learned to breathe it back into the air. One journalist who visited the site years later wrote that he felt the trees seemed alive, leaning toward him whenever he stopped moving. Even after the government bulldozed the remaining shacks, the forest reclaimed the ruins unnaturally fast, swallowing up paths and landmarks until nothing but the faintest traces of foundation remained. Yet on certain nights, residents swore they could still see light flickering through the pines, and if they stood still long enough, they could hear children laughing or crying from somewhere just beyond the reach of the road. Nearly 15 years after the arrests, when public memory had dulled the horror of the Goler case into a half-remembered cautionary tale, a small independent film crew arrived in Nova Scotia with the intent of documenting the tragedy. They were a group of 6, 3 filmmakers, 2 sound technicians, and a local guide, hoping to produce a quiet, haunting documentary about isolation, generational poverty, and the psychological toll of seclusion. The working title was The Forgotten Valley. At first, their project unfolded like any other. They interviewed surviving townspeople, sifted through old police reports, and recorded scenic shots of the mist-drenched hills. But when they decided to visit the actual site of the Goler settlement, something in the air shifted. The forest was different from what they had expected. It wasn't just the silence, it was the sense that the valley was waiting. The moment they crossed into the clearing, their equipment began to malfunction. The camera lights flickered, batteries drained in minutes, and microphones picked up bursts of static that sounded almost like whispers beneath the noise. They laughed it off at first, assuming interference from humidity or magnetic minerals in the soil. But the anomalies grew harder to dismiss. While filming, one of the sound techs replayed a clip he'd just recorded, an interview with the guide describing the family's isolation. And in the background, faint but clear, a child's voice could be heard saying, "Don't go under." There had been no children anywhere near them. That night, they set up camp near the edge of the clearing. Around 2 a.m., one of the cameras, left running to capture ambient footage, began to pan on its own. The film later showed the lens slowly turning toward the tree line, where a dim orange glow pulsed between the trunks, flickering as if someone were walking with a lantern. Moments later, the glow went out, and the camera shut off abruptly. When the crew reviewed the footage the next morning, the timestamps revealed that the recording had stopped exactly at the same minute every one of them woke from a nightmare they couldn't describe. The local guide refused to stay another night, claiming he'd heard someone whisper his name from the woods. When the film crew returned home, several of their recordings were found to be corrupted. But one clip survived, an audio segment filled with overlapping voices that no one could isolate or identify. The director described it as the sound of wind layered with something almost human, a chorus rising from beneath the soil. It was then they realized that whatever had haunted the Goler Valley hadn't ended with the family. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for someone to press record again. Months after the documentary team's footage made quiet ripples in underground horror circles, a historian named Caroline Ray visited the Goler site for her own research. She had studied folklore and patterns of rural isolation for years, and the Goler case, with its mix of poverty, secrecy, and superstition, drew her like a magnet. Armed with maps, an old police inventory, and curiosity, she hiked into the overgrown clearing where the cabins once stood. Most of the area had returned to wild growth, the forest reclaiming what human hands had disturbed. But near what had once been the central shack, Caroline found a patch of earth that seemed recently disturbed. The ground was uneven, and fragments of wood protruded from the soil like broken ribs. She dug carefully, uncovering a rusted tin box wrapped in fabric so decayed it crumbled at her touch. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, the pages stiff and yellowed, the name Mary G. written in trembling handwriting on the inside cover. At first glance, the journal appeared to be the scattered thoughts of a woman trying to make sense of isolation. It described the seasons, the births of children, the deaths of animals, the hunger that came each winter. But as the entries went on, the tone shifted. Words became erratic, the handwriting uneven, as if written in haste or fear. Mary wrote of the blessing, something passed down through blood, something that had to be fed and respected. She described strange rituals performed under the hill, candles, chanting, and Ruth, who she claimed was the one chosen to speak with what slept beneath the ground. She called Ruth our protector, yet also our debt. The entries suggested that Ruth had not been alive in the ordinary sense for years, yet her presence was constant, watching over them through the children's eyes. One passage in particular froze Caroline. When the children are born wrong, it means the offering was not accepted. The blessing grows restless. Ruth will come walking. That line appeared multiple times throughout the journal, always written in darker ink, as though emphasized during moments of terror. The final entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The ink smeared as if the page had been closed in panic. When Caroline brought the journal back for analysis, specialists confirmed the handwriting matched that of a Goler woman who had died decades before the 1988 discovery. The dates made no sense. There were entries written years after her recorded death. No one could explain it. Some claimed the ink had bled through from earlier pages, while others insisted the book itself had been tampered with. But Caroline noticed something else. On the inside of the back cover, faintly scratched into the leather, were the words, "She still lives under the hill." Years after the valley had been sealed off and the case relegated to old archives, a new forensic research initiative reopened several sealed boxes of evidence from the Goler investigation. Advances in genetic technology allowed scientists to test biological samples that had been impossible to analyze in the 1980s. Among them were fragments of bone, strands of hair, and tissue samples taken from the graves found near the settlement. What began as a routine archival project soon veered into something that unsettled even the most seasoned researchers. The DNA results didn't align with standard human profiles. Certain markers appeared duplicated, others missing entirely, forming irregular patterns that suggested generations of genetic manipulation through extreme inbreeding. But there was more. Some sequences contain mutations never before documented in any population, as if the genetic code itself had been intentionally altered or influenced by an unknown factor. At first, the team attributed the anomalies to degradation from age or environmental exposure, but further testing ruled that out. The samples were remarkably well preserved, far better than they should have been given the conditions of the valley. When the team examined the remains more closely, they discovered that one of the skeletons, a child no older than 6, had bone density far beyond what would be expected for someone of that age. Another had elongated eye sockets and a jaw structure slightly misaligned with human norms. These weren't deformities caused by neglect. They seemed patterned, almost as if someone had been trying to create a certain result over generations. Digging deeper, the researchers found that the Goler's genealogy showed deliberate pairings between specific family lines, reinforcing the idea of planned isolation rather than coincidence. Old documents suggested these unions had been recorded with symbols instead of names, patterns identical to those carved into the trees surrounding the settlement. It appeared the carvings were more than superstition. They were records, markers of lineage and selection. The unsettling part was that the mutations didn't stop with the bones. Soil samples taken from the burial sites contained strange organic traces, proteins and enzymes that shouldn't have survived decades underground, almost as if something within the graves was still active, still changing. When the results were quietly shared with the provincial authorities, the project was abruptly shut down. Official statements cited data contamination, and the materials were sealed once again. But one member of the research team later leaked a fragment of the genetic sequencing. It contained a repeating strand that spelled out a word when translated into a rudimentary cipher, Ruth.